Okay, so like Serena said, I'm Josh Andrews. So I am a nutrient management agrologist with the BC Ministry of Agriculture, Food, and Fisheries. If you were on this call a little bit earlier, you probably heard me tell Serena that you guys are going to get sick of me soon, mostly because I spoke last week and I am speaking twice tonight. So the first presentation today that I'm starting now is Forage Nutrient Management 101, which of course has a lot of information, which I have hopefully distilled down enough to fit into 30 minutes, but probably not the most exciting presentation in the world because it is quite dense in things. But I promise the legume and nodulation one is much better. So today I just want to go over basically the definition of nutrient management and how we think of nutrient management through the 4Rs. Do a little bit of review on the essential plant nutrients and how they behave in soil. Talk a little bit about our nutrient management strategy for forages, which I think is mostly geared towards the interior based on our audience, and go over the 4Rs there. And then lastly, go over nutrient deficiencies, how you detect them, and how you correct them. So starting off, excuse me. What is nutrient management? So if you look at our website, you'll see this helpful definition that says nutrient management is using our nutrient sources such as manure and fertilizer to optimize crop growth and minimize risk to water and air quality. But of course, for some of you, that probably doesn't mean a ton. So in the context of forages, what it really means is using our fertilizers and using our manures effectively to make sure we're producing a healthy forage crop. But not only producing a healthy crop, but also maintaining the desired forage species that we want, because our nutrient management does affect the mixture out in our fields. And we're also looking for effective use of fertilizer and an efficient use as well, so that you're getting the most bang for your buck, and you're also saving yourself time and money. So with nutrient management, usually as a mnemonic, we kind of break it down into the 4Rs, which are the right source, the right rate, the right time, and the right place. So if you think about those in the context of your crop, those are kind of the most important things you need to think about to grow the crop the most effectively. An important thing to remember is that these influence each other. So for example, if your source can affect the time that you apply. So if you were to apply manure, you would need to apply that well in advance of when the crop needs it, because it needs time to become available to that crop. Whereas with mineral fertilizer, it's available as soon as you apply it. So just something to think about there. So with the 4Rs, in forages, the right time and the right place, these are usually pretty consistent. So normally we want to apply in the spring, and most of the time we're going to do a broadcast application, with a few exceptions. The right source, that's when it starts getting a little trickier, because you want to balance your availability and the effectiveness with the cost. So last week I talked a little bit about pH. So if you're thinking about applying nitrogen, ammonium sulfate fertilizer is probably cheaper than something like calcium nitrate. But of course, the ammonium will lower your pH, whereas calcium nitrate will not. Or another thing is, if you want to apply manure, manure has a lot of nutrients, it has a lot of micronutrients, and you want to apply it, but maybe you don't have enough for the whole field. So that's when this balancing act with source comes in. And then the last thing is rate, which is probably, as a ministry, what we spend the most time trying to figure out, because fields are different, soils are different. I mean, even weather, a few kilometers away is different. So that is a very tricky thing to figure out sometimes. So a little bit of review here. Essential plant nutrients. So your forage crop needs around 16 essential plant nutrients. Sometimes people say 17. I'm going to go with the older model of 16. And these are needed in varying quantities. So I'm sure you've heard of micro and macronutrients. The macronutrients are nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, sulfur, calcium, magnesium. And together, those will end up accounting for around 3.5% of your plant just by dry weight. And then micronutrients, chlorine, iron, zinc, etc., those don't really account for a whole lot of the dry weight of your plants, much less than 1%, less than 0.1%, actually. So this table that you're seeing here is actually from Alberta, but this is one of the reasons or one of the things to think about when you're applying fertilizer is how much is this crop going to take away from my soil? So for each ton of dry matter that is received per acre from your field, around 30 to 35 pounds of nitrogen is going to be removed. Going farther down, you see phosphorus. Each ton is going to remove around 4 pounds per ton. Or if you think about it in fertilizer terms, 10 pounds of phosphate. And then going farther down, it gets to be less and less. And nutrient management is kind of based on the law of the minimum, which is an old rule when agriculture was first starting to be studied, that yield was limited by the nutrient that is the most deficient. And so normally they use this barrel analogy. So if the barrel represents, the total yield potential of your field, whichever nutrient is the most deficient is going to be basically the maximum that yield can achieve. So even if, say, like heat and sulfur and phosphorus in this barrel are higher, nitrogen is the lowest, so that is the fullest yield you can get, is the least or the most limiting nutrient. So moving on to how nutrients behave in the soil. Some nutrients are held in the soil and you're able to build them up. So nutrients like phosphorus, potassium, calcium, and magnesium. And for those, we are particularly concerned with the soil test levels because we can use these levels to determine, based on the crop, how much we need to add. But some other nutrients like nitrogen and sulfur cannot be built up really in the soil, mostly because they will leach through soil profile. So we need to add them way more regularly than the other nutrients that we can build up. So why are these nutrients different? So the first thing is the negative charge of the soil. So nitrate and sulfate are negatively charged, and so is your soil. So if you think about when you're a kid and you're playing with magnets, they repel each other. So those nitrate and sulfate can essentially move through your soil profile and not really touch anything. And they can leach well below your plant roots, so it's just gone. It's unavailable for that plant to take up. And there are also some differences in the nutrient cycles. So nitrogen and sulfur, their availability is really based on bacterial activity. So bacteria can take, these organic nitrogen and organic sulfur, basically an organic matter, and they can turn it into something that is plant available. But they can also do the opposite. They can take something that is plant available and make it unavailable. Whereas phosphorus and potassium and a lot of the other nutrients that stick around your soil, their availability is more based on soil properties. So if you were around last week, you probably heard me talk about soil pH. And then the soil cation exchange capacity. So for example, potassium, it's considered a cation because it is positively charged. And so since your soil is negatively charged, your soil can really hold on to that potassium molecule pretty tightly. And then it can make it available for the plant to take up. So for our nutrient management strategy, really the basis of that is soil testing for us to know what is going on and what is available to the crop. And normally we recommend doing that around every 3 years. Some places you may need more. Some places that are more intensively managed, you may need to do it every year. But the important thing is to focus on the areas that you're managing really intensively, that you really rely on for a good crop. Like I said earlier, soil testing for a lot of nutrients are used to determine the rate that we need. But with our nutrient management, we also need to consider the timing that we're going to apply things, the placement, and the source. So moving on to rate, the first thing I want to talk about is the nitrogen rate, because nitrogen is normally the most limiting nutrient for grass production in British Columbia and pretty much everywhere. I don't know too many places where nitrogen is not the most limiting nutrient. So nitrogen is something that we want to add every year to get our optimal growth and yield. And I'm sure a lot of you know that it also affects the crude protein content of your forage. And as you saw earlier in that table at the very beginning of this presentation, each ton per acre that you from grass crop will remove around 30 pounds of nitrogen. So if you're getting several tons per acre yield, then you're probably need to add close to 100 pounds of nitrogen per hectare just to recover the stuff that's removed. So normally with nitrogen, an annual application is needed, mostly because nitrogen has been taken up, and also because it's mobile in the soil. So areas that have high moisture will also need more nitrogen, mostly because they have more growth, but also they will have more loss. So if you think about the lower mainland versus the interior, there's a lot more moisture, it rains a lot more, so the growth is a little more productive, but also in that rainy season from October to about February, like all of that nitrogen will be essentially leached through the soil and be totally unavailable to the crop. Another thing to remember is that nitrogen rate can be reduced in legumes, mostly because of their fixation abilities, and there will be more on that later, because that is the second presentation I'm giving tonight. So for nitrogen rates in the interior, normally we would recommend in a non-irrigated field, somewhere around 30 to 60 pounds of nitrogen per acre per year, which is similar to the 2.5 tons per acre yield that a lot of people get. But if it's irrigated, nitrogen uptake is a little more efficient, so you can probably apply somewhere between 60 and 100 pounds of nitrogen per acre per year. And then in the lower mainland, they're applying, somewhere between 200 and 400 pounds per year. And then in alfalfa, you normally want to keep that below around 35 or 40 pounds per acre in soil, because that can actually reduce the ability of that plant and the bacteria to fix nitrogen from the atmosphere. So that's something you always want to be careful about. Never put a ton of fertilizer on your alfalfa at one time. So an important thing to remember about nitrogen rates, and really rates of any nutrients, is that more is not always better, because sometimes the increase of yield is more, you get a less yield for the cost that you spend on fertilizer. So if we look at this 90 pound per acre of nitrogen versus 120, there's only about 0.2 of a ton difference. So if you got that, it was worth about $10 to increase that yield, but you spent $100 on fertilizer, I don't think a lot of people would think that's worth it. And I know Dieter showed a similar graph last week, but looking at this graph, if you plot, the amount of N added here on the x-axis and the yield on the y-axis, when you add nitrogen, you're going to improve yield, but eventually you're going to reach a point where this line flattens out, which basically means you can continue adding nitrogen fertilizer, but the yield is not going to go up any farther. So also for rates, moving on from nitrogen, phosphorus and potassium, which are our two next leading nutrient requirements, those are normally based on our soil test levels. So I'm sure many of you have seen these tables before, where you take your soil test results, and then you look across the table to see how many pounds of phosphorus or how many pounds of potassium you want to add. And these soil test levels are correlated to growth. It is not how much is available. So for example, if you have a soil test and it says 10 parts per million of phosphorus, that doesn't mean the real concentration is 10 parts per million and you can just go, oh, I multiply that by 2 and that's 20 pounds per acre. Those numbers are actually correlated to how well that crop is going to grow. So the way this is actually determined is there are sufficiency trials. And so as a ministry, we know at what point the concentration in the soil when growth is not limited. And then for any concentration below that, they test using different fertilizer rates to see which will get you to the highest maximum yield. And then sulfur. I don't know that sulfur has been talked about a lot recently, but actually in British Columbia, it's normally pretty low. And it's actually it's low for the first time in a lot of places where they have actually improved their air quality, because burning coal for electricity is normally what releases sulfur into the atmosphere and then supplies it to the soil. But of course, in British Columbia, there's a lot of hydropower, so we don't normally have a lot of sulfur in our rainwater. So definitely something you want to test for when you're doing a soil test. Normally you want to see it at about 20 to 25 parts per million, or maybe a little bit higher. But it's not something you have to apply in very large amounts. So even if it's considered to be very low, so looking at this table, which is between 0 and 10 parts per million, you need to add probably 25 to 30 pounds per acre to get the maximum yield and not let sulfur be limiting. So after rate, another thing we need to think about is timing, because you want these nutrients to be available for your crop when it requires it. And so normally this is the spring, because as it starts to warm up, that's when the crops decide they need to start growing, and for them to grow, they need nutrients. Most crops grow the best between 20 and 25 degrees Celsius. And timing is also based on our nutrient source. So like I said earlier, manure needs more time to become available. Most fertilizer is already available. So if we have a manure that we want to apply, normally you want to get it out in the field somewhere between 2 and 5 weeks before it's needed by the crop. So those soil bacteria can work on it, they can break it down, and then when that crop is ready, it will be available in the soil for uptake. So this is just an example for nitrogen, but we're looking at plant growth basically on the x-axis as time goes on. And then on the y-axis is the nitrogen uptake, which is the percent of its total uptake. So in between these dashed lines, there's a period of exponential growth. So there's this window where the crop is going to take up the vast majority of its nitrogen. So we always want to make sure that right when plant growth starts, that nitrogen is available. So when that rapid uptake and that rapid growth occurs, that it's able to take up that nitrogen. As I said earlier, nitrogen and sulfur can both be lost due to leaching or runoff. So we want to apply both of these in the spring just to make sure that we don't lose it over the winter. However, nitrogen is something we're probably going to apply every year, where sulfur is sometimes one application will last you a while, especially in areas that don't get a ton of rainfall and lose a lot of their snowmelt and runoff, because if there's not a ton of water to move that nutrient through the profile, then it will stick around for a little while. So other nutrients like phosphorus and potassium, you don't really have to worry about loss as much. So when you're establishing a forage crop, we want to incorporate that in the soil prior to our planting in the spring, and that puts our roots into contact with those nutrients. With established stands, you can apply things like phosphorus and potassium in the fall, but uptake is actually higher in spring, mostly because crop growth, and it's actually a little bit more available in the soil immediately after application, especially with phosphorus. I think I've heard roughly, 70 to 80% of phosphorus is unavailable to the crop, 3 or 4 weeks after application. So another thing to think about with our 4Rs is our placement. So during establishment, we can incorporate things like phosphorus, potassium, calcium, magnesium, and sulfur. But actually for nitrogen, we want to broadcast this after seedling establishment. And then in established forages, like I've said earlier, most of the time these will be broadcast applications, which of course it can lead to a buildup of nutrients in the upper part of the soil profile. So those top, 2 or 3 inches is where most of the nutrients are found. And you'll notice that those roots will tend to be most dense near the soil surface. And then in some established forages in the South Coast, there is injection of manure instead of broadcast applications sometimes. Moving on from placement, thinking about our nutrient sources. I'm sure most of you guys are aware that there are many different types of fertilizers. Some of you may use single nutrient fertilizers depending on your soil nutrient levels. Urea is the most used fertilizer in the world, which is of course a good source of nitrogen. For phosphorus, a single nutrient fertilizer is triple superphosphate. And then for potassium, another example is muriate of potash. And these are good if you're sufficient in other plant nutrients and you're not worried about trying to supply more than one nutrient. So if you did need more than one nutrient, you'd probably be looking at something like a blend. So some common examples are ammonium sulfate, calcium nitrate, 8-24-24 or 10-10-10. And those are good if you need more than one nutrient, but one of the downsides is the fertilizer is not always quite in the same ratio that's needed for the crop. And if you can't find someone to do a custom blend for you, then you may end up over applying a certain nutrient. So nutrient deficiencies. So this is a corn crop, and of course, looking at this picture, it looks super clear. You can tell those are all different symptoms. So phosphorus and magnesium, they still look fairly different. Potassium and nitrogen look totally different from each other. But in forages, they're not quite that simple. They might be a little bit easier with legumes, but visual symptoms is probably not the best way to diagnose a nutrient deficiency in forages. So if you do suspect a nutrient deficiency, very first option is to look at your soil test. So if you have a field that you suspect has a nutrient deficiency, you can compare that to another field and see if you see a difference. But a second option is tissue analysis. So you can take samples from areas that look fine and then areas that look like they might have a deficiency, and then you can compare those to help you kind of figure out what's going on. And so with that, I think I had 5 minutes left. Hopefully that is a concise overview of nutrient management and forages. I know it was a lot and I probably went a little fast, but hopefully I can answer some questions.